Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and Champions of Chaos recently released. It's a new DLC format which has been received rather well as it kind of breaks up the monotony of just Lord Packs, Lord Packs and Lord Packs. Not only that, but it gives a lot of attention to the Warriors of Chaos who, let's be honest, desperately needed it. Now, the format is really good, and Creative Assembly have gone out and said that if enough people like this, they'd be looking to do it again. And I really hope so, because it's got a lot of promise and it can fix up a lot of races who might have different cultures. And there's one faction which could really do with a DLC the style of Champions of Chaos. And that race would be the Vampire Counts. Now, I've spoken about this very briefly in the DLC video, but I want to make it in much more detail. You see, the Vampire Counts themselves are extremely varied. You might not believe so if you've never played tabletop before, but prior to 8th edition, there were different bloodlines that you could play which had different rules, and in lore, they even have different units too. So right now, when it comes to Total War Warhammer, we're basically just playing the vanilla Vampire Counts. Basically, the 8th edition version was just Von Carstein and then some Necromancers, and that's pretty much it. Now, we do have some minor lords, like for example a minor Strigoi, and with the Blood Kissers, we can actually pick up some other legendary lords, well, pseudo-legendary lords, which are tied to, say, the Lumian Bloodline, the Blood Dragon Bloodline, hell, any of the actual main ones, barring the unknown bloodlines that disappeared into the Far East. But it's not very much the same, is it? It's not really like if we're playing a Lumian or a Strigoi, we're still playing a generic Von Carstein, essentially. We're just playing Manfred or we're playing Vlad. We're not really exploring the other subcultures. So what if a DLC like Champions of Chaos came into effect for the Vampire Counts, which introduced a lot of different characters and even some FLC, and just gave us a little bit more in an effort to make all the different vampires like they were in 6th edition, one of the best editions of Warhammer Fantasy. So what I want to do here is jump into all the missing bloodlines, what they could get, just having a little bit of mixes here and there, and go from there. And I think this is going to be a decently sized video, so yeah. Let's jump right in. So keep in mind this would be very much the same as the Champions of Chaos, where you get a bunch of units, but yes, they're using a lot of the same stuff, like the rigs, the animations, some assets. It will just be what a lot of people are calling reskinned units and stuff, but I feel like it really fits here as it kind of makes sense. So we'll start off with my favorite bloodline because, you know, it's my channel, so I can do that. This will be the Strigoi, which already starts off in a pretty good place, mostly because it's already got a Lord option, which is the Strigoi Ghoul King. So generally, all it would need now is a Strigoi hero and then some extra units. Obviously a legendary lord, but we'll get to that in a second. When it goes with units, it doesn't really need too much either, as the Strigoi would be kind of similar to the Von Carsteins, but you wouldn't be using such a lot of undead units. It would actually be focusing more on ghouls. So maybe another variant of ghoul and another variant of crypt horror. Maybe give the crypt horror some ranged attack so you can have like a ranged version too. And there you're good to go. But that's only for undead units. You see, the Strigoi would also, back in the day when they had their little empire, work with a human faction known as the Strigoi. And even long after their fall, the Strigoi still exist as a nomadic people, and they still miss the Strigoi. So these are nomads, these are fairly weak people, they depended on the vampires to protect them. So what you would get is like the Bretonnian units, so this would be the peasant soldiers, the peasant mob, maybe the men-at-arms, the spearmen-at-arms, the peasant archers, and even the mounted yeomen, and then just use those rigs, use those animations, but just kind of reskin those units. That means that you'll have a very drastically different type of army with just this, as you'll be focusing on ghouls, crypt horrors, and some living servants. Still have access to the units from the Vampire Count roster, because those are like interchangeable, they were used by every bloodline. But you'd have a few unique units only available to you. So think about this in the Champions of Chaos sense, where these would be your Cornate units, and the Soneshi units would not be accessible to you. Then for a Legendary Lord, I mean, there's a few different options. Vorak Bloody Tooth is probably a good idea, considering that he's quite well known, or Yushoran. Unfortunately, none of these guys have models, but they're big enough names in lore to justify having a model made for them. Yes, they are dead, but their territory exists, you know. You can have them in Morcane, which is where the Strigoi Empire basically started, and that's a pretty good start position in general. They just have to move Malagor a little bit, I'd say, Or by the time that we do get a DLC of this standard, you know, we're likely just to have so many legendary lords that they'll be border to border. Lots of the areas already, well, they're already kind of like that anyway. So a possible mechanic for the Strigoi would be focusing around reforming the Strigos Empire, which, you know, is not that exciting when you hear about it, but imagine giving you opportunities to take over locations, and then you'll get powerful bonuses the larger and larger the empire gets. Now, in itself, it's not supposed to be extremely massive, because it wasn't really a big empire. So essentially from Morkane all the way up to the Fortress of Vorag, maybe a few other locations, but it's enough to give you incentive, and these campaigns aren't supposed to last too much. Instead, you'll start to have other types of things going on. Like, for example, the other bloodlines could be working against you. Neferata could be trying to stop you by sending stacks through events. And that's enough to keep you busy, really, isn't it? If you manage to get the whole empire, you'll get some powerful faction-wide bonuses, and that means that you'll be able to then just take over the rest of the world if you want to. If we go into the Blood Dragon section, well, there won't be a lot of units too. Keep in mind that I'm not expecting as many units as Champions of Chaos, but it's going to be done a little bit differently as there's more factions to deal with. So, Blood Dragons, maybe dismounted knights. I think that's probably the best thing, as it gives you stronger melee infantry, obviously a proper Blood Dragon Lord and a proper Blood Dragon Hero. That way you can actually theme your armies to have Blood Dragons and Blood Dragon Heroes. So afterwards you'd focus around some units, so again, maybe Blood Knights but on foot, having some variants, so sword and board, additional hand weapons, and then the halberd just for some anti-large. You wouldn't be expecting a lot, and these would be very high tier. These would be very, very high tier. Maybe Initiate Unit 2, just a new Blood Dragon that's learning how to fight. So weaker mid-tier infantry, but still quite strong because, you know, they'll be faster, there'll be a vampire unit. But really, you don't need that much. You've already got a decent amount because you already have the Blood Knight units that were available as an FLC a long time ago. As for Legendary Lords, there's pretty much two options, which is Wallach Harkin. He's a well-known character. He is the ruler of the Bloodkeep for a large majority of the time, so he's pretty much taken over charge of the Bloodline at this point. Or Aborash, which is a very interesting character because he's the founder, he's the sire of this bloodline, and he's also not affected by the Curse of the Vampires because he managed to best a dragon in battle and drink its blood. He's also known as one of the strongest fighters in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and he's very honorable. He's not, let's go destroy the world, but rather he sees the bigger picture in things. Obviously, these would be melee fighters, not really spellcasters. Well, they'd have access to some spells, but in a weaker form, but that's expected from a bloodline which focuses on a lot of fighting. Yet I know this is a very popular bloodline by a lot of people, which is why we see a lot of mods spawn up because of it. With regards to start position, I mean, the Bloodkeep is something that could be done, which is in the Southern Grey Mountains, but if the congestion is too high, they could easily move them anywhere. If Aborash ends up becoming the Legendary Lord, he could literally start anywhere in the world. Also, with regards to the Bloodkeep, we don't know exactly what's happening there, as it looks like the lore is changing for Warhammer the Old World, where the Bloodkeep is more or less around near Zufbar, and that would be way too close to Vlad, which might be a tad too much congestion by having all the Vampire Lords very close to each other. We just moved Manfred away, why bring someone else into it? When it comes to the Blood Dragons for a possible mechanic, I mean, it's pretty simple. You would get your lords who would start off in maybe a normal state, so just as strong as a average Vampire Lord, a Vampire hero, but you can do missions. Missions will pop out where you'll have to hunt down dragons, and if your lords can then hunt down the dragon and kill the dragon, which should be quite strong, it should be a very difficult battle, then they become empowered, right? They no longer have the curse, which makes them much, much stronger. This will give you incentive to travel around the world and just hunt down dragons in general. And if you end up fighting a faction that already has a dragon, well, that should automatically help all the vampires that you have in that specific army. I think it would be kind of cool, and maybe Aborash, if he ends up becoming the Legendary Lord, has to fight like a very, very big dragon. You know, he is already cured in this point of the lore, but just for thematic sake. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Lumian Bloodline, because I know this is the one that most people actually care about. So, in terms of missing units, there's only really one, which is the Coven Throne, and obviously then a Lumian Lord and a Lumian Hero, just to kind of add a little bit more of effect there. Then I think maybe some units could be reskinned here, as the Lumian vampires are Nehakarans in life. So it could be that the Lumians would have access to some types of Tomb King stuff, just to add in a little bit of flavor. So like their Grave Guard would actually look very similar to that of Tomb Guard, you know, just to add in a little bit. And while this is sounding more bare, keep in mind that it's not supposed to be a carbon copy of Champions of Chaos, where in fact the Legendary Lords themselves are supposed to have their own unique mechanics. As you recall, the mechanics in Champions of Chaos are basically copy-pasted from their respective monogods, so a lot more dev work has to go into that. Right, so then Legendary Lord, I mean, it's very obvious, Neferata. Neferata is a character that many people have been waiting for. She is the sire of the Lumian Bloodline, and, well, you know, Silver Pinnacle starts. It's very simple for this character. We already kind of see how she is. You know, she's been hinted enough through the lore. She's very, very popular. So even if you have a basic knowledge of the character, you already pretty much know, well, if she ends up being introduced, this is how she's going to be. When it comes to possible Lumian mechanics, I mean, it's a bit tough because it needs to be very stylized to Neferata, obviously, and there were mechanics introduced in Total War 3 Kingdoms for Cao Cao, which were like a really, really detailed version of an influence mechanic where you could make enemies fight against each other, where you could make them lose cohesion, you could make so much. And I think something like that could work really, really well. Unfortunately, at the moment, I don't have access to Free Kingdoms because I'm recording this from my laptop, and downloading it from this laptop is just way too much of a problem. But it would be extremely stylized. I do actually have a video which goes over this mechanic from like 2-3 years ago, but I'll have it linked down below just in case you want to check it out, because it is actually a really good mechanic. It's something that's really stylized. It's the first thing when I played that DLC in early access, I actually thought this was going to be something in the future for Neferata. Keep in mind that a lot of stuff from Free Kingdoms, such as the mechanic that was used for Lubu, did get transferred over to Taurox. Oh, and when I actually did make this video, Creative Assembly shared it, so they probably have a very similar idea. So yeah. And lastly, we have the Necrotic Bloodline, which, again, you know, Lord, hero choice, and we'll talk about the Blood Kiss mechanic in a little bit later for this video, but just hear me out. Then maybe just some monster units, right? So say, for example, the Patchwork Man, all this type of stuff, monsters that you would expect the more necromantic bloodlines to focus on, right? This is stuff that you'd also expect Heinrich Kemmler and Helman Gorst to have, so they also have access to this too. It's just very important that they get something to kind of fill them up a little bit. So again, just some basic units, nothing too special, you know, and obviously the Lord choice. When it comes to a Legendary Lord, it would be probably Zacharias the Ever-Living. He's something that everyone's kind of waiting for. He's a Necrotic, but he's actually very strong, but he's also a very strong spellcaster too, so he would be a hybrid Legendary Lord, just to give you a little bit going there. Plus, all the other big Necrotics are pretty much dead. I mean, Wursaran kind of isn't, because it's a weird thing in lore, but I think Zacharias would probably be the most liked out of them. As for a start position, he could be literally anywhere, so that kind of works out, because you can literally have a vampire anywhere, especially a Necrotic, which is obviously always going into different locations just to kind of find knowledge, find tomes. So yeah, I think it's fine. I mean, generally he's known, and the Necrotics are kind of known to be in the Southlands, but that's already too much of a Thunderdome, and Zacharias is known to be throughout the Empire, but obviously that's also a bit of an issue too. So I wouldn't be opposed to putting him into Cafe until we actually get a Cafe Vampire, and then you can easily put him in Ind if that opens up, because the great thing about how Warhammer 3 works now, I guess you guys haven't noticed, or you have, is that the flyovers don't exist anymore. You don't get the basic introduction anymore, and that was introduced to allow for Legendary Lords to be moved around so easily. They don't need to re-record with the advisor. It's literally just, okay, this character doesn't work here, we can easily move him here because the fan base wants him here. Alright, so for mechanics, this is where things would get a little bit more different, where I'd say they'd have to hunt down for knowledge, but not in the same form as the books of Nagash, but rather the same mechanic as Oxyotl, where it will start up with missions. You'll get missions every now and then, and you'll have to go to those locations to be able to find the tome. This will also be kind of very similar to how you do treasure hunting with a Vampire Coast, but the idea is to go find these things that'll get you powerful bonuses. The important ones will be permanent bonuses, and the minor ones will be temporary bonuses for your faction wide. and it will give you incentive to travel around the world. You won't be able to instantly teleport, so you'd have to send an agent that way for a minor one. Or if it's a big one, you'll have to send an army that way too, but the idea is to give you incentive to move that way. And I think something like that would work out quite well. Now, the Coven Throne would be pretty much the only unique unit, which, yeah, I know is disappointing, but the idea is to have very stylized mechanics for each of the factions instead, and really, there's not a lot missing for the vampires, let's be very, very honest there. So I'd say, since the Coven Throne is the only unique unit, what would happen is it would be usable by all the bloodlines, because it kind of makes sense, you don't want to get rid of unique units from other factions, and it would just have like a second or even a third variant, 2 variants for Neferata. And I think that's kind of fair. Now, thankfully, all these characters can essentially be in the Realm of Chaos map, so it doesn't mean that this has to be an Immortal Empires campaign only, so it doesn't have to be DLC only. Now, the great thing about these vampires is most of their locations that they hang out in, well, it's actually within the Realm of Chaos, which doesn't have that many legendary lords compared to Immortal Empires. So the Bloodkeep can be added in, the Silver Pinnacle is in-game, because obviously the Darklands are there. Really, the Fortress of Vorai can be used for a Strigoi. It's simple enough. Although I'm not completely against a possible Immortal Empires only DLC. But really, yeah, something like this can easily fit into the Realm of Chaos map. And while I do think that it is possible to have Immortal Empires DLC in the future, I think the vampires are easy enough to squish into the Realm of Chaos without too much of an issue and just have lords there to have some fun. Because we will have to wait at least a little bit of time for the fan base as a whole, or at least a big majority, to create DLC for just Immortal Empires. At least that's my reasoning, right? But we're not done yet. Okay, so FLCs, there should be 2 rounds of FLC. The vampires need a little bit of a rework, and that's kind of expected, so that would come around here. They've also been alleviated a little bit because of Champions of Chaos with the new Raise Dead mechanic, which works out quite well in my opinion. But what else could be added in? Well, we'll talk about the Von Carsteins. Obviously, that bloodline needs something to make them quite unique, and it's not going to happen to Manfred. Manfred already has his unique mechanic, but Vlad, being the head of the Von Carstein family, could have access to the Elector Count's mechanic. He is a rightful Elector Count in lore, and it would be pretty interesting if he could actually form the Empire in his own right, where you could either vassalize all the other human electors, or put some other vampires there. It might not be the most stylized and detailed mechanic, but it's something that would be a lot of flavor, and it's a lot of things that people have kind of wanted for Vlad. It's actually been highly requested. But also give access to some state troopers to Vlad to be able to recruit them. It was actually a thing from the Storm of Chaos where he'd be able to actually build up an army of humans if so he wanted to, because there are humans living in Sylvania, they're not all dead. Vlad actually knew the value of humans because they needed to feed. If vampires killed off all the humans, they would soon die out themselves. And then there's more. So obviously we do have an elephant in the room, and that is the Red Duke, who rules over Musalon now. So why not make him a full, proper playable legendary character only available in Immortal Empire? So you'll need to own the DLC and the free games to get access to Immortal Empires, but if you do so, you'd get access to the Red Duke as a playable legendary lord with his own faction, a healthy mix of vampires and Bretonnian units which have been reskinned to be, well, you know, evil Bretonnians, where you get access to a Black Grail Knight as a lord, which would be your Vampire Grail Knight. You get access to damsels, but with the lore of vampires. It would give you an alternate start, which, yes, would be kind of expensive to have, but that means that you've got something completely stylized, which means that you'd have your complete and unique playstyle, because it would be a pure hybrid faction, and hybrids would be cool, as we know that this is possible with the introduction of sub-races with Champions of Chaos. So I think that this would be big hype for people, as that means that you'd have essentially a new race to play with. And something like this, which would be so radically different, would give a lot of people incentive to buy any of the missing games that they might not have, or even the DLC. So I think it just adds to a lot of extra stuff here. So you can see that the DLC would be different. It would be very similar to Champions of Chaos, but with its own spin, but then provide a really big FLC bonus too. As a final note, I'm not too sure what could happen to the Blood Kiss mechanic, as, well, the issue is the Blood Kiss mechanic is pretty cool, and it adds in a lot of Lord options, which could actually end up being the generic Lord options, which means that those would have to come in as FLC, but some of them look kind of crap, let's be very honest, like the Necrotic, they're just not looking good. They are a very bad kit bash. So maybe what could happen is that the Blood Kiss mechanic could still be in effect, just change the bonuses a little bit more and maybe change around how it would work. So if you're playing as a Strigoi, instead of having the options to recruit a Lumian or all the others, you would just get the option for Strigoi, and maybe the others could be replaced with other Strigoi. It would use the same model, but you'd just get different benefits, which I think could actually work out quite well. We'd have to wait and see, but these are just some basic ideas. The idea is I want to see something really cool for the vampire counts, and I feel like the Champions of Chaos format would be very, very, very good for them, as it would add in the rest of the bloodlines, and that means that people could be able to play as their own bloodline. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Let's start a bit of a discussion. I'm rather curious to see what you guys think, as, yeah, this is a very different style video, but I feel like this DLC format is so good to be able to explore upon that it needs to be explored upon.